Won't you teach me how to fly like the dragons in the sky?
Hey, it's Joel. I'm here with the Taproot Therapy Collective podcast, and I today I'm going to be embodying the archetype of the trickster and the mad prophet. I'm here with James Waits, who's going to be embodying the hero and everyman protagonist, and then Alice Hawley, who will be embodying the divine feminine and the Earth Mother archetype for a discussion on dragons. But one of our therapists, James, has written a short story. I'm going to read an excerpt to get us started here. This is the story of Ames Weightless, the warrior. Ames Weightless, the warrior of renown, scaled the craggy cliff, his muscles rippling underneath the black leather of his armor and gambeson that girded him against the dangers of the mountain. He cast open the heavy doors to the dragon's lair, unsheathing his trusty wand, Pointer. "Who are you?" the dragon scowled. "How are you able to make it through my layers of bureaucracy? I am the worm, known as Wind's Chaser. I live on this peak, above a cruel labyrinth of bureaucracy. In many years, no one has ever cut through the web of red tape I wove to protect this place." "I am different," Ames exclaimed. "I am from the age of millennia," the dragon gasped. "A millennial, from the land of IPAs, wide leather belts, and the dulcet tones of sad but strangely upbeat folk music with stomping in it. How have you made it here with your clear glasses and revolutionary ideals? How have you survived the crushing downward mobility I have cast on your age? But it is no matter. I thought my cronies had done a better job gatekeeping. However, you will never unlock this chest here." The dragon gestured towards a glittering box with its majestic talons that it was beholding. "I did not need to," Ames exclaimed, "for it is not your treasure that I need. The treasure I carry inside myself and my bespoke leather wallet." The dragon gasped and recoiled from the light as he produced the sacred talisman, a license to practice social work anywhere in Alabama. So it's a really beautiful prose, James. Like, we appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing some of your writing with us there. James didn't write that.
I hope you did, or
Yeah.
AI. That'd be great.
So today we're going to be talking about dragons and just kind of some of the ideas of dragons and culture metaphors. Before we get going, do y'all have any associations? Anyone read fiction about dragons or consume dragon media? But do kind of a pop culture dragon thing. Anyone have any kind of associations that come to mind?
I mean, the only thing that I always think about is Falkor from Neverending Story, like the luck dragon. And
Is that the dog? I don't know the Neverending Story once as much. Is that like the dog dragon?
That is thing? It's the dog looking thing, but he is considered a luck dragon. So
it's considered a dragon. Okay.
Yeah.
Alice, you got anything?
Oh man. I'm not I haven't been steeped too much in fantasy young adult novels, but so my dragon lore is probably limited to like How to Train Your Dragon, and then I have all this divine feminine kind of dragon lore there, but kind of in the pop culture realm. I don't have otherwise a fixation on dragons.
Well, and we can get into that. I'd like to get into some of the somatic stuff of the divine feminine and how that shows up. But so the history of it that I think is interesting is if you look at people who are coming from kind of a depth psychology background, generally like the assumption that is going to be made when they're studying like the origin of consciousness and like how people evolve to basically become sentient, realize that they're alive, separate from the natural world, like all of those things. They're making a lot of parallels, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, probably in a way you couldn't ever prove, about how when a baby is born, the baby comes into the world and it doesn't really know that it's separate from mom. It doesn't really know what it is yet. It is not individuated. And then slowly as it becomes, 1, 2, 3, the baby starts to realize like, oh, I'm my own thing in the world and become conscious and all of these things. And so a lot of the early myth work around dragons and the kind of story of humanity is viewing humanity as having kind of done the same thing, has come from a place where they're part of the natural world, part of the animal world, and then slowly kind of like separate. And in that process, you see something that is similar to what an infant that is sort of coming into consciousness would be doing. And so when Jung or Edinger and Neumann any of those people are writing, a lot of that is what they're writing about. And one of the ways that they do that is that if you look at mythology, one of the first places we see dragons is embodying this kind of like archetype or association with like a powerful, usually female and also like natural world that's like nature. And then as consciousness and like the ego develops, there has to be like a, traditionally masculine hero that slays the dragon and then, makes this, kind of like order and new, egoic consciousness. So, in Babylonian mythology, Mesopotamia, you get, Marduk is the hero that goes out and slays Tiamat, who's like the chaos dragon of the night, and to female, and then makes the world basically from that. And then in most myth systems later, the world goes kind of too far into like masculinity and hierarchy and order, and then the kind of female potential has to rise up and tear it down. So like in the Greek tradition, you get things like what do you call it, the Bacchanals, like where the when there's like too much order, too much masculinity, too much like law and rule and the things the Greeks associate with masculinity, all of a sudden like Bacchus will cast a spell on the women and they become like feral and go to the woods and wear vines and like eat wild animals off the bone and tear the civilization down, and then order is restored. And so when depth psychologists are looking at these things, it isn't kind of like boy girl, masculine and feminine. It more is like understanding that all people have both of these forces, and the gendered language you can take or leave because it's maybe a little bit dated, in some respects. And it more is about the kind of assertive and ego principle, and then the more unconscious, passive maternal principle of long-term thinking and long-term growth and things that in the ancient world are associated with women. So I don't know, that's kind of a jumping off point. What do you guys have from there?
No, I think it's interesting that we have all these stories of like kind of world creation or destruction myths regarding and centered around dragons or type of reptilian type, things. So that's very interesting. And then, trying to think of Thor and God, what's the world eating snake? Defeating that.
Yeah, I think it's just the mid. Yeah, okay. So I learned it as Midgard serpent, but you're right. It's Jormungandr, or however you say that, a monstrous creature. Yeah, Loki's generally a trickster in Norse mythology, so he's associated with all these things that are like not great, but kind of inevitabilities. The way Norse myth treats dragons is like the way it treats most things, where it's just kind of like, these are going to happen. Like if you read the Poetic Eddas, like the poet's just telling you the whole time, like, don't get drunk like I did, because when you do, you'll do these things, but eventually it will happen, and then they'll be fighting. And there's this kind of this understanding that when you have a whole bunch of people together, when there's a big party, when there's a lot of alcohol, Loki will kind of sneak in through the back door and start to create this chaos. And eventually that will end the world, and then it'll be reborn. But I don't know. I think dragons in myth, like me and James were talking right before Alice got on, about how like you could kind of see how like in the natural world, like in a prehistoric culture or like an early kind of Bronze Age culture, you look at an animal and you can make a lot of parallels to humanity, different archetypes of humanity. But like when you're looking at a lizard or a snake, it's like so different, like even a fish, like it maybe feels more similar to you or is easier to personify. But it makes sense that maybe dragons would contain, serpent-like creatures would contain like the parts of ourself that we are the most distant from, or the most threatening to us, why they would show up in Eden and different things. Alice, do you have any reflections on that? I mean, I know we've talked about a lot of these things before, so I don't know.
I think when you're talking about them representing or kind of looking to us, it's almost like, a snake is like our stripped down nervous system. It's like our essence. Yeah. It's like just the head and like our spine, and then all the other extra stuff is gone. And so they carry this maybe like field that's similar to ours, but they just kind of in the 3D just have like that. And
yeah, so snake is just a spine, where like it's almost like just our brainstem without anything else, which artistically that's interesting. I know Kundalini yoga does a lot with like the coiled golden serpent or something. You probably know more about that than I do. And then evolution, the oldest part of our brain that we deal with a lot in trauma therapy is lizards,
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think it is that, yeah, there is, and I think it's like the rest of, once you get away from, and we've evolved away from like the serpent, we've done all these things to create our body to kind of fulfill things that maybe the serpent, I don't know. It's kind of hard to put in words, but yeah,
Maybe
I
it's
think
more primal or older.
that it's more primal. Yeah. More primal. But like, it's like, I don't know, almost like interdimensional. Like there's sort of like a layer to like their existence that we can't see. Like we just see like and I think that's like, but it's just like the beingness in the earth maybe. And that's like kind of the reptilian or like the reptile part of the brain. And I kind of then start thinking about reptilians, but the reptile part of the brain, that's just all based on like fear. It's like, fear-based, totally like response is all.
Yeah. And can't make slow movements, like
Right.
if you look at a chicken or something that doesn't have the more mammalian parts that we have, like their head just kind of jerks around. If they want to look at something, they can't slowly be like, what's up? Like they have to just kind of jerk, and they have these inherently reactionary type of processing. It's almost like an antenna, like the snake is picking up this information, whether that where that transmission comes from, I don't know, just the deep patterns of the body or something else. But there's a lot of hay made with that, and kind of polyvagal theory, newer trauma, medical stuff, but also in new age and spiritual movements, you see that a lot. James, do you have anything?
Sure. Not that comes to mind based off that, but that does no, the medical aspect of, paramedical aspect of who we are and our lizard brain. And I was actually thinking about that, like the snake and its skeleton is just a head and a spine. But if you, strip away all that we are, our head and spine just kind of go hand in hand together. So we're little snake people.
Do you know am I wrong about that yoga stuff? Like, doesn't Kundalini have something to do with like the snake as like an image? I know I've seen that in different methods. Can you say anything about that?
Kundalini and Kundalini yoga, or Kundalini energy is represented by a snake. It's a serpent. It's coiled in the base, seen as like this. It's kind of this extra dimensional energy that's not literally coiled in the base of your spine, but it rests there in the energy body. And you can have there are different things that can happen in your life that can activate your Kundalini. You can have like trauma experiences, or you can meditate your entire life and like have a Kundalini awakening that way very slowly. And but it's represented by the snake, and it is seen to it rises up the spine when you release it. So you release it like with yoga or with other practices, and rises up the spine and into the pineal, and activates the pineal gland, and then the energy starts flowing back. But it's all about the snake, like initially like slithering up the spine.
Do you have any personal experience with that? You feel comfortable talking about like the feeling or the phenomenology of like when you make, because I know that I think my wife does Vispanyana or something, but there's like a lot of different schools of thought in yoga, and Kundalini tends to be the one that's trying about removing an obstacle, making a breakthrough. And generally, like, I think models of like somatic and experiential therapy that are more pushy have more kind of potential to be transformative, but also are a little bit more dangerous, in how you go about them, because you're activating all of this, energy that is some intuition, some trauma, I don't know.
Yeah. And Kundalini yoga, it's very, the dragon energy is in there. Like it's breath of fire is the backbone of Kundalini yoga. And that's, essentially we are like using like heating up the body, oxygenating the blood and flushing everything out, our trauma and everything, using this particular breath. So there's a lot of kind of like burning away trauma, burning away imbalance in that practice. And Kundalini, that's a loaded topic about Kundalini experiences, awakenings, etc., and like kind of the feeling there.
How so?
I think there's a difference between like a full-blown Kundalini awakening, and then sometimes people just have like a Kundalini experience that's like a very like, I I think some people who you know, are doing like ayahuasca or something, might be having a Kundalini experience, but it doesn't necessarily like where your that energy is released from the base of the spine, and suddenly you have access to all this greater consciousness than you know, your average walking around person. That's what we're talking about, is like awakening your consciousness and making you awake within the reality. But I forgot where I was going. But,
How do you see as like the difference between those? Is one good? Is one bad?
So a Kundalini awakening is when you've actually integrated all that stuff. So if we can take like using ayahuasca as an example, maybe, and I don't have experience with ayahuasca, but just using it as an example, like that is something that opens up your consciousness and gives you access. And there are many other things that, and practices, and particularly like just breath work and things like that, but give you access to higher consciousness, where all of a sudden you kind of know answers to things that you didn't otherwise like.
Is it more of a remembering what you knew already and kind of a clearing away, or is it an actual like viewed as like an insertion of new information?
Initially it's like remembering, I think, like what you're saying, remembering what you knew already. But there is this sense of like there's the fire kind of burning away the stuff that isn't relevant anymore. And then it's like all of a sudden you get all the pieces, are like your brain connects parts of puzzles that you never really realized your brain was working on this whole time. So that happens. But then when you have a full-blown Kundalini awakening, you've kind of flipped into where your brain is naturally hooked into higher consciousness as you're walking around, and not just like for a few hours. It's like you've actually fully awakened and cracked into, and it's like do you know, when it's released, when the energy is released from the base of the spine, it goes up, and then you want to channel it back down. But basically there's like, you're trying to eliminate, like there's an echo that happens like from the signals going up and down the spine. And so you're eliminating the echo.
When you say echo, do you mean that the body isn't able to hold like the new kind of potential, or the new potential for cognition or somatic reaction, or what do you mean?
Yeah, I literally mean like if you there's a,
or you feel like an up and a down.
I literally mean an echo from, and I can't think of the language, but like all the way up and down your spine that carries signals, that's always going up and down and up and down and up and down in our spine. But if you activate your Kundalini energy, you activate it totally so that it's not having to send signals back and forth. This is also like breaking the bridge between the right and the left hemispheres of the brain. Like it's overcoming that, so there's no longer an interference pattern there, and then you suddenly have access to but and then in a real Kundalini awakening too, you're also like, not only are you remembering stuff that's like suddenly things in your own life are making sense, but everyone has different experiences, but you might have insight on, or like feel like you're remembering things that never happened to you before, like things from the history, things from just
kind of a wide identification.
And it's sort of like in the sense that, like, you know, when people will have a brain surgery or something and wake up and all of a sudden know a new language, that there's no reason for them to know, like that type of stuff is sort of like what you're activating when you have a Kundalini awakening. So those types of things will come on where you have all of a sudden this knowledge that there's no real reason for you to have it, except that what we're seeing is that it's like you've sent this highly charged energy up into your pineal gland and activated it, and that's your antenna to the universe. That's your antenna that it connects us with greater consciousness. Is the pineal gland, and it's also the one that's responsible for, you know, circadian rhythms and melatonin production, and but that is it's not studied. I mean, it's not I don't know. It's just like it's not studied, but but it's not. I don't think it's given as much credit as it needs to, because I think it's just largely misunderstood. Because it's hard to wrap your head around concepts like people being able to just intuit all of a sudden have a download of an entire language, for example, or something like that.
Well, it's interesting. Like if you look at evolution, like the origin of like what the pineal gland is doing with hormones is originally something that the parietal eye is doing. Like in our evolutionary past, there's like a clear scale on the top of the head of like a lot of lizards, some sharks. But in the past, that was a lot bigger of a thing. But there is this whole like part of the brain that is primitively trying to process like a cosmology, like awareness of the world around you, like the lizard. Because one of the things the parietal eye can do is detect the polarization of light, which tells you the time of year it is, because the sun will go through different amounts of clouds. And so, a snake or a lizard with a parietal eye, Komodo dragons still have one, will handle the same environmental stimuli to mate or eat or hunt or travel differently at different times of year based on this felt sense of the world around it. And so there are, it's neurologically possible, hard to prove, that there are these kind of deep brain structures that are still, gauging all of this information about the world. We lose the physical eye, as the mammalian system takes over, but we still have this kind of cosmology making part of, our deep brain. I think that a lot of people contact with different types of language, different things. I mean, James, last time you were talking about how you had a lot of patients that when they were healing trauma and working with you, that they had like an increased creativity and kind of an openness to spirituality that was almost scary or disconcerting. It seems like in what Alice is saying, there's a lot of room for what like the Buddhists might call spiritual bypass, where somebody sort of co-opts the language of an actualized person that has a genuine revelation or vision or, something sustainable. And then they take the language and they start to just kind of grift and, you just, because you're talking about something you can't quite talk about or you can't quite prove. And so there's within that, you have people who borrow the language of, I don't know if you're familiar with, that's a question. So I'll stop. Yeah.
No. Yeah. So yeah, I think that when you get to that point of connection and try to figure out yourself, there's a lot of scary things, and it kind of equating to, almost kind of like shadow work in that sense of, when you get so connected and fight and, work through all these things that you've come to kind of therapy for. It's getting kind of comfortable with not necessarily your alternate self, but, that shadow aspect of you, which is a lot of kind of, it kind of reminds me of that somatic feeling of how do I feel gross? I know I'm not gross. I feel gross. And then, that you could be both at the same time and kind of incorporating all that. And when we were talking about
kind of like being able to sit in paradox or tension of opposite parts, have two parts of you, the multiplicity of self becomes more, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. I'm asking if that's what you mean. Well,
kind of, it's sitting kind of in the paradox of kind of, but then you work through being okay with that uncomfort, and not in a weird way, but kind of, you have to accept that part that is still wholly you and still kind of all of you. But, but it's that realization, it's that it's that thought, it's kind of being that conscious self of, yes, I mean, being okay and not okay at the same time is a very interesting feeling. And not necessarily through trauma, but just in general. I think of it like sitting on a comfy couch, like you're sitting down, but like it may be made of wool and it's very, you don't like that feeling, but you're still resting. And so being okay with like, okay, I am sitting on the couch and things like that and working through that. But it kind of, when we were talking about dragons, it was kind of that thought, and I was doing a lot of like looking into kind of that shadow aspect of how dragons and things like that, and kind of equating that to it. Like in a lot of, a lot of things, dragons are beautiful, but also bring destruction and all.
Yeah.
Or they hoard things. So they still might be pretty, but they want the prettiest things and they keep hoarding it. And so we look at that, and I was kind of looking at that of being a part of who this person is in front of me, and how to, you can be okay with being seeing this dragon version of yourself or this shadow version of yourself and incorporating to who you are, and that makes you fully whole person. And that's a crazy feeling for some of my clients that come. It's just incorporating that being okayness, or being, finding comfort in the uncomfort has been pretty helpful for them, that this is a normalization. So it was interesting that when we talk about dragons, it's kind of looking at that, like even in kind of pop culture, that when we see dragons, we don't get scared. We are like, it's a dragon, every time something pops on the street, so it's kind of looking at that, of that's how we should treat ourselves, in a sense of, we're not, oh my God, fearful. It should be, oh, this is us, this is normal for us. So
yeah, I think there is so much of like seeing dragons as a part of ourself we don't understand, that gets a lot of hay made with it, and different fiction and mythology traditions. A lot of times, like, the dragon is both beautiful and terrible. It symbolizes some kind of inevitability, but also there's a beauty in that, or some part of you that is scary, but ultimately rewarding. Alice, when you talk about like the kind of new age associations with that divine feminine like energy, could you say anything about like you're familiar with like spiritual bypass, or that idea that you can like I know there's a writer that
when people, it's like over intellect, it's like an intellectualization, but it's spiritualization where
sometimes, like, I think the intellectualization where people are kind of talking about things that they've read without experiencing them, that's something that comes up. You're using the language of experience without the experience itself. Like that's something you see. But there's also this tendency to be like, to get rid of the ego and disband it with meditation or drugs or something inherently is integrative, which isn't true. There's a ton of people that take acid and go to a Fish concert and then go back, and they didn't work through anything. They're not taking, you're making the music weird or whatever, but you're not really taking anything away. And there's a guy who wrote a story about working with people with meditation a long time ago, and he was saying that these people would take 2 years off life and go to Thailand, and some of them would come back and they'd be totally different, but they tended to realize that meditation wasn't the point, that like you were kind of the point. The people that were like, well, I came back and I had the same fight with my dad and I'm in the same toxic stuff, but I feel like I know everything because I meditated with monks for 2 years. Those were the ones where he felt like it was this kind of spiritual bypass of just as a nice trip or relaxation, turning everything off. But you're still there when you get back because you're not really using the opportunity to go in and slay the dragon and work with the shadow. You're just kind of turning off your ego and then turn it back on. I don't know. Do you see that? I mean, you work more in kind of spiritual communities than I do, I would think.
I think and that's an interesting, I think there's an interesting line because, there is the hermit phase. Like, and so there is sort of there is this period in any person's, journey to enlightenment or journey to integration where you want to, where like the universe like asks that you cut yourself off from everything and go and remove yourself from your life, remove yourself from different, I say to people like, remove yourself from social media, remove yourself, like stop watching the news, do all these things, and just go completely within. And so sometimes like from the outside, somebody who's doing that, like having a true hermit phase or has had something maybe in their life that was a catalyst for that, and they might choose to go. I'm saying there like several different things that could be happening here, but I think that there is like a legitimate version of like, people are saying like, this is a new me, like there's something new here, like I'm newly experiencing myself. And it's like, that's a person who's waking up in a life that they're suddenly like, okay, this isn't necessarily like what is reflective of me at all. And so then from the outside perspective, we have to be able to be like, okay with and on board with like somebody being able to like reflect on and change who they are, how they present and how they how they show up in the world and what their values are and what they want to do with their time. I think we accuse people of like maybe spiritually bypassing because maybe there's a legit place for, if you have a really crappy, meaningless job to all of a sudden have a spiritual awakening and then, want to do something like go travel the world or do something that's not going to make any money. And that's the person who we kind of look at as the crazy person, but it's sort of like to keep going and going and going to something, to a job that's just killing you and just resigning yourself to that. Like that's actually the bypassing spirituality rather than
Yeah, I think that's right. That, ultimately you are there's no one who can tell you if you're doing the work or not. There are people who maybe are good guides but ultimately it's between you and your relationship to the thing. A lot of things that I've done in my life that resulted in good stuff later, like I didn't even know why I was doing it. I could probably tell you now, what I was working through, but it looked crazy and maybe felt crazy. Starting a therapy practice is maybe one of those things that just felt like there's something on the other side of it. Nobody can see it. I can't see it, but I have to do this because I feel like there's a higher way of knowing that I'm in conversation with something. I think what I meant with spiritual bypass was more the people who take the language of actualization to kind of talk about those things. But what you're really doing, and a lot of time they've convinced themselves, I think. Very few
They've
of them
kind of gotten stuck. Yeah, they've got, I do know what you mean.
like you take your own bias and trauma and then you say, oh, actually, that's a higher spiritual purpose. Like when I was growing up, there was a lot of, in the Christian tradition, people were like, well, you should be afraid of people who look like this or do that or do these things. And it's just like, well, it's convenient that all of those things are just not you and you don't know those people or have any experiences with it. You know what I mean? And you're kind of putting that into the mouth of the divinity and then saying, oh, well, yeah. And, but I mean, people do that just as much, I think, like on the more kind of liberal left with like something where you're like, maybe you could change your relationship to this thing or do work or kind of face a part of yourself that you're running from. And they're like, no, I'll just buy a crystal or I'll do this. And it's like, ultimately this is about your relationship to yourself. And those things are pathways to do that, but the pathway is not the destination. I don't know if that makes sense or if you see that. I was wondering if if that was something that you see or comes up, Alice or James, in your practice.
Yeah. It definitely does, and like, that's like with everything, people can kind of use it in an unhealthy way or kind of, but I think, I don't know. I don't know. We'd have to talk about a specific example because for the most part, I'm just like, how harmless is it for people to want to have a crystal?
Yeah, the point isn't to call people out or something. It's just kind of I know my own.
I'm trying to think of the type of people who are the spiritual bypassers that I get. It's when people are the people who start getting high and mighty is those people who are
when you think you have power over other people because you're so enlightened.
Yeah, that's when when you start preaching to other people, that's when you're probably spiritually bypassing. But at that point, you're not looking in the mirror.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that type, the high and mighty, of becoming that kind of legalistic role of judgment of others is so hardcore that you're kind of missing the point of how free you actually are. I've kind of actually
by pointing out that other people are not free, you feel like that feels like freedom, but it isn't.
Yeah, you're just kind of counter to what you want. But I put up these two angry dragons on the couch because that's kind of like. That is definitely in couples, is that, when a lot of people use that spiritual bypassing.
That's a great example.
When they're kind of looking at the other and trying to say, I've had it where it's like our relationship's failing because, that we don't have the same beliefs or we're not on the same page in beliefs and all these things. And so something so ingrained in them and it kind of not accepting the journey that somebody else has. And then that person who's pretty angry with the other person with not being on the same page tends to have that legalistic role and kind of that judgment. And I point out, it's like, that's not what you're supposed to do. If you believe in this type of, that Christian God is the final judge, like you have no place in judging. And it's weird that, they walk through their life with these moments of, I tend to be legalistic and I broke away from that. And now I'm back again. I'm like, well, why do we come back? What? And it's kind of failure to kind of reflect on yourself in that sense. And it's kind of, you use that and say, oh, well, this is what it says and they're not doing it. So you don't have to look at me.
It's the speck in my eye versus the speck in yours is that the Bible, says. But then there's also those, like, I think a lot of those lessons can be misappropriated from especially like Eastern things where, you really, it's like something like marriage counseling, we're supposed to realize, relationship counseling is supposed to realize that we're out of touch with a thing that we need from another person, which is kind of why we're attracted to them, and we're accepting help, and that they are also doing the same. But what you can take a lot of that language that is about how you should take something bad happening to you or abuse as like a lesson, or meditate on compassion to justify abuse, basically, which is not really, I think, the point of those wisdom traditions. It more is to, when something bad happened to you, it's a lesson to kind of confront yourself, but that doesn't mean that you should go out and defend those things in the world or justify them in a way when you can change. So I don't know, when you look at like the way that the East and the West handle dragons, like especially in fiction, I think that is similar to kind of what y'all are saying, but our relationship to the ego, because like in the Western tradition, dragons tend to be bad, and they hoard gold, and they're very egoic, and they're very greedy, and they're just kind of beasts. Whereas like the Eastern tradition with like something like Taoism and the yin yang, like they're more likely to see bad, quote unquote, bad things as like a balance or a cycle. And you see dragons in Eastern traditions have more of that cyclical nature of, even if the thing that is happening is bad, it's part of a process that is inevitable or timeless, or just part of a greater whole. I don't know. Have y'all ever read any like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or Wheel of Time or any of those series as they were coming out?
Lord of the Rings for sure. The other ones are a little too long for me.
Yeah, I think I read like 14 books of the Wheel of Time in like when I was in like middle school, and then I quit. And I think they just now got finished by another author because the guy died. Yeah, they go off the rails in the same place that Game of Thrones goes off, where they're both written by world builders. They can't get their arms around the worlds that they build enough to finish up the plot. And I think George R. R. Martin with Game of Thrones, those are very kind of Western English style dragons, whereas Wheel of Time, there's not even a dragon in the series. The dragon is like a metaphor for this cycle that's very Ouroboros and cyclical, and Jordan is definitely writing from like a more Eastern perspective on them. But what do you think about the way that like culture, sort of uses dragons to contain parts of itself or talk to parts of itself? That was Game of Thrones, I think, had like a huge impact that like not even the author probably intended on culture. It was like everything that people talked about for 2 years before they quit. Why do you think that was? I mean, what do you think that speaks to people? Because it was like you had like accountants and like normies, for the lack of a better word, that were like supposed to be watching football, and they're like trying to talk to me in the hospital, by the water cooler about dragons. All of a sudden, it's like, wait, what's going on?
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think that was about, or what is it that made that Game of Thrones something that was such a zeitgeist for a minute?
I'm like, you tell me, because I'm like the only person who didn't. I don't know. I just don't vibe with it. I couldn't. It just felt too dark for me. But I know and I watched all of it. I was sort of forced to watch all of it.
Oh no!
And it sort of got So I mean, and that's a whole other story.
You suffered with the dragon of Game of Thrones.
That's a whole different. That's a different trauma story. So yeah, but yeah, I don't know. Because I sort of I didn't really understand. They're not like how there's not really like a resolution towards good that, and I don't know.
Yeah.
I had an ex who had been very into those books, in the early 2000s, and was like early Reddit, like following, like very into like following everything George R. R. Martin was doing. And I just couldn't ever get into it. And then it turned into such a huge deal. And one of the main writers went to my high school here in town, Indian Springs, one of the main
oh, wow.
Yeah. And his episodes were always really good, but I was just like, they were really well done. But I don't know. There's something dark, and I'm just not sure. I'm always like, well, what's wrong with me that that I can't do it?
I'd kind of like to do a longer episode on them because I think they're complicated.
Yeah.
But yeah, James, you have what is your experience with Game of Thrones?
I have not read them, but I watched the series, and it's a very interesting I actually, so one crazy thing about me is that I love spoilers. So I will look at
Probably be some Game of Thrones spoilers, FYI. Hit
yeah.
pause if you
Well, no,
don't want to
no,
know.
I'll try not to. I love spoilers, and so if a series comes out, I usually typically didn't watch it until it was done, and I would just like read what happens in the series, or if a good movie comes out and definitely goes in theaters before I went to before I'd go to see it, I'd actually read the actual plot of the movie, like the full and yeah. So Game of Thrones was the first thing, kind of the first type of series that I did not read spoilers on, because I know I could just Google it and see what happens in the book, but then it was so intriguing that like the whole books versus TV shows and TV series was kind of just like, oh, we'll see if it goes in the same direction as the book. So I didn't want to like read one thing and then the series be about another. So I went into it blind. I kind of just like said, I don't know anything about Game of Thrones. And it turned out to be something that I like had no idea was going on. Like, and I think what really intrigued me is I really like the series, like Pillars of the Earth they made.
Yeah, that's a great series. They are very similar.
So historically, yeah, I think the Game of Thrones, some of the stuff is based around the two fighting families or three fighting families of
the War of the Roses. Yeah,
Yeah.
he said several times, if I was a better writer, I'd write historical fiction, but I'm not a good enough historian. So I mean, it very like Starks and the Lannisters, the Yorks and the Lancasters. I mean, there's a lot of on the nose parallels there.
Yeah, so I went into it, and then when I started seeing those similarities, I'm a big history kind of guy, and so I was like, oh, this is interesting, but I had no idea. But when the dragons came out, I was like, man, that's the cool dragons, and you see the dragons grow up over time, and you're thinking like how their personalities change. It's a very interesting show. I did not like.
I mean, the dragons are really compelling. That is one thing I liked about Game of Thrones.
Well, when I think like just because it's not a terribly political show, like I don't think that they're like it isn't trying to be Parks and Rec or something where somebody's just like writing their political beliefs to lead you back to them or something. I mean, he's just kind of trying to build a world and let it live. And Martin is, I think, a more left-leaning guy. Like he was a conscientious objector to Vietnam, and there's some things you can see, but the series, like it really was like picked up by people who were very right-leaning, very left-leaning. And I mean, there are spoilers because he'll probably never finish. I don't think he'll ever finish the books. I just don't see a way that he can. I think it'll probably be similar to somebody like Robert Jordan that just can't quite get their arms around it because they're not going to change their pacing and tone and the way they write to wrap up a series. And Martin he started, and they both started as a trilogy, and then they ended up becoming these 15 volume, things that just couldn't end. And but you had people who were like very kind of like liberal feminist, like naming their daughter halfway through the series. Khaleesi was like, the joke for a minute. And George R. R. Martin was being like, wait, you don't know how it ends because, spoilers, like she does a genocide. Like the dragons are fundamentally uncontrollable forces. And, the protagonists, some of them lose to forces like inside and outside of themselves. And I don't know that I don't think the end of the HBO show is what Martin would have written, but I don't know that we'll ever know what Martin wrote. But if you want to guess, I think that that's where he was going. These things are kind of a dead age. Valeria died. You're trying to kind of bring back this old glory and empire and power, but it really is not something that anyone is in charge of. And it's not something that is going to come back, that it's kind of time for the next part of the cycle. And I think when he says, I love Tolkien, but I'm not ever going to do Dark Lords, I'm not ever going to do good versus evil, like the White Walkers are not just the orc army, there's more nuance here. That's what he means, is that he was trying to write a different type of fiction, but we may never know that. So you can't say that I'm wrong. Don't email me.
And then the prequel series that's going on, that's still is all about the dragons. And then you're thinking, I get too deep in the weeds with that of how did they just become extinct? And by the time that Game of Thrones picks up, there's only eggs, and then bones of other dragons. But in the current series, it's just like, man, there's a lot of dragons and like riders and stuff. And then you think about like, what if they lived, or what if they were different? What if they were kind of like the Eastern luck dragons instead of just like the medieval type fire breathing dragons and how different Game of Thrones would have been.
Yeah, the Eastern dragons tend to be more of like a serpent, kind of a celestial thing, whereas I think Western dragons tend to be more of like a monster, a beast. They're more, um, but what you're talking about in Game of Thrones, I think that's like one of the places where the world building does work for me, because if we ever do a longer episode on that, there's a lot of places where it doesn't. Like one of them is they say that because the winter is really long, like the winter can last a super long time, it's like held the culture back. And I'm like sitting there like with the like anthropology history lens being like, no, like you can't, like you're saying that for 2,000 years you've been stuck in the medieval times because the winter is cold. Like there's no way in a literate culture to just like, that would just be like, because we had a 2-year winter, we're still in like Bronze Age technology of like Jesus. Like that just doesn't work for me as world building at all. And there's like some, people will fight with you and say there's other things, but I think as the metaphors, he tends to get the metaphors well in the world, and the other things are kind of, plot arcs you have to close in order to get where you want to go. But I mean, when you're saying that, why do the dragons die out? I mean, a lot of the extended universe stuff says that they're wild animals and they need to fly around and eat stuff. And that they have this ability to bond with Valerians. The Game of Thrones dragons are kind of racist. So you have to have the right genes or they don't like you. But these people, he kind of writes about them like the same way people write about like horses, that they're like, you have this magical connection with the horse and it bonds with you or something. But like when they try and make them basically imperial weapons and build the dragon keeps and feed them all this stuff, they die out. They're not able they have to be, out there and alive. And then the books, I think, do a better job of that than the show does. Kind of explaining that they're trying to make something that just is not sustainable, basically.
But there's good commentary in there somewhere,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think he is comfortable with political realities and kind of realities of the ego that are interesting. And
I guess, yeah, that's like the war machine in general. Like you're going to feed, and nothing really good comes out of it, and other people suffer, Yeah. So.
Yeah, exactly. And he does, those are the political elements I think that works for me. Like he talks, there's just so much in the books about how winter is coming and everyone's about to starve, but that people are doing war instead. And I think there's some kind of climate change and economic and sustainability parallels that he's doing that are the more progressive elements of the book. But, like it was on HBO, it had nudity, it had violence, it had like manly warriors. So no one, at least I didn't see, accused it of being like woke, or I didn't see a political backlash to it either way. Everybody seemed to be kind of united and liking dragons for 2 years.
Yeah.
Gore.
Yeah.
Suffering.
Well, I know James has got to hop off right at 11. Do you have do you have anything to close or kind of closing thoughts on? This is pretty open-ended discussion. I don't think we're going to solve dragons in an hour.
There's so much.
Yeah. If you have a second, Alice, I'd like to talk about some of the somatic stuff, associated with it, because I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
I don't have any closers.
Just.
Oh, well, thank you, James. I appreciate it. And
yes.
We can, what do you want to do next week? What's the next one?
Oh, I don't know.
We'll have to email and come up with a thing. I wonder and then maybe, I don't know when you have to hop off, just hop off when you need to, but I was curious, like one of the things I hear from the somatic experiencing people and the lifespan integration people that I've talked to, it feels, I don't know as much as you do, but it feels a lot like some of the Eastern perennial philosophy stuff. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a lot of times when somebody's assertiveness is turned off, that manifests like in the chest is tight and hot. And then when you're able to, initially they're kind of afraid of that somatic release, but when they do, it moves up into the throat and the mouth and the head. And that feels a lot like kind of chakra work that I've heard about, but I don't know a lot about it. And those people are not coming from that lens, but they're still observing those things. And I've heard that called dragon energy. I wondered if you could speak us out on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always like gonna, like, I guess what you're seeing there is like energy that's trapped. You're talking about energy that's trapped in the heart, maybe, and chest pressure and energy there. So maybe traumas that kind of impact like how is it okay for me to be vulnerable in the world, and then to release that. And we want, as we're doing energy work or Kundalini yoga or other things to make that energy flow up. You're aligning your chakras that way. You're flowing that energy up, and so you're releasing like from the heart through the throat. And there is, essentially burning away. It's like that instinctual, where the dragons are fire breathing. They're breathing like the spark of creation. It's not just weird destruction. Just like was it you or James who said like the dragons have to live? They can't just like be kept there and held for their gold. But I think and like releasing into your throat chakra is how you speak your truth into the world. And so to unclog your heart chakra would kind of help nudge open your throat chakra. And then there's just like this message of truth and vulnerability, and that burns away any unneeded vulnerability.
I see that in emotional transformation therapy, which it's Dr. Vasquez's model out of Texas, but he uses color. And there's a lot of evidence that a lot of the ways that we process color has these somatic associations. So you're using that. But a lot of times when somebody comes in and they feel like a black hole sucking around their chest, during somatic work, or they feel like a burning heat, it's green is the color you work with. And then green will kind of turn into blue-green, which is throat, and blue, which is the mouth. And then at first it feels overwhelming. They don't really like it. Most people don't believe that colors have any kind of somatic association until they start to do ETT. Because I definitely wouldn't have, and until I felt it. It was pretty interesting stuff. And then you start looking at how the brain works, and there are, neurobiological pathways that make sense, that aren't just memory associations, but the way that we react to color. But a lot of times you do see it go from green to blue-green to blue, and then people talk. They have all this stuff to say. They're angry, and they feel like that's a problem. And it's like, no, that's good. You're able to know that you have a right to life, to the world, to be seen, to be heard, just as much as anyone else. And that comes up as a kind of fiery anger. So that metaphor makes sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It's like you've stripped away or kind of cracked out of the shell is suddenly like burned away. And so you're a live wire in those, in that energy. But yeah.
Well, and it makes sense why it would be hard, like going back to the spiritual bypassing, like hard to know if I'm going in the right direction, if I'm doing the right thing. One of the mystics I like, Simone Weil, says you have to go into the labyrinth and you have to keep walking and not even know if you're going in the right direction, and not know if you're just going in circles and you're going to starve. That the darkness has to be that intense, and there has to be some kind of principle of faith for you to keep going. And I think a lot of those early kind of somatic encounters with the self or just unconscious information, when you start to make contact with that in therapy, people initially are scared, which is why I think dragons are an interesting metaphor for all that stuff. The beautiful and the terrible, but also the self.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating archetype. And I think the distinctions too between, we could talk a lot about what you're saying about the Western and Eastern versions of dragons, and maybe there's more of like a kind of masculine overtone to like how the West usually kind of frames dragons, and then the East.
I think they want to have a monopoly on the ego. I think that the difference in those are how we handle the ego. That's like why it comes out differently in art. There's very different assumptions about things like energy and what even the nature of identity. Like in the East is a lot of times around collectivism, that you're a part of a group or that you're a small part. I remember seeing a paper on how like protests in America versus protests in China, how the crowds reacted. And the assumption in the Chinese crowds was that like the greater good was the group, so people would kind of take individual risks to do whatever. Whereas I don't know, like I think that a lot of that changes when you see sort of historical cycles or empires falling, or an idea like the mandate of heaven, that just have a ruler for a while and then eventually they lose the mandate and that empire's wane, and all of your identity isn't caught up in maintaining the empire or the current political thing. Then you do get this more balanced take on like, oh yeah, it's a cycle. It's bad when the seasons change, or it's uncomfortable for a minute, but it also is not something we can stop. So we kind of have to see this as an inevitability. Whereas the West is more about control and trying to
Right.
make something permanent.
Yeah.
Um,
Power structures of power hierarchies.
yeah. Maybe that shows up in our dragons.
I was thinking about this is just really random. Back when you were talking about the parietal eyes, like
Mhm.
making me remember. Is that like where like we have a fontanelle? Like, is that the same place?
I don't. That's a good question. I don't think it's where the skull stitches in infants. I think my guess. I don't know that, but my guess would be that we lost that long before that, because a lot of that is a result of having to not be born in an egg. That you kind of come out. You have to be like
Right.
live birthed, and then the body has to account for all these changes there. So I think the pineal system is probably pretty established long before
Yeah.
before that, but that would just be a guess.
Well, and I think so. Not necessarily that it's like, but like energetically that it might be the same. And then I meant to say this a long time ago, but in Kundalini yoga, or in different yogic practices, many different spiritual practices, you cover the head, like the fontanelle. That's like, that is your antenna, that's your crown chakra, is that same place. And so it is sort of, we're kind of talking about the same thing, I think. That parietal eye of, sort of our dragon energy.
Yeah, I forget the name of the tradition too, but that's one of the reasons why I think bringing up a lot of the New Age stuff is important, is it shows up in all these cultures without any kind of idea exchange. So people are coming at these same ideas. And there's like a mystical Jewish tradition about like making yourself a root between heaven and the earth, and like the top of your head becomes purple, or it just depicted artistically purple. And I forget the name of that one. I have had some clients that were into it, about 10 years ago. But a lot of those have to do with you. What would you say?
Like Kabbalah, something?
Yeah, it's similar, but there's a specific name. I'm not remembering. But there's something about that. You basically root your body to the earth, your bottom and your legs and your posture, until you feel the top of your head, kind of turn on.
Yeah. In those, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of interesting, in those traditions, that's, you're protecting like your spirituality and things. And you kind of do notice, like going out in the world, that there's sort of a difference when you have something on your head. Not like when I've been in like trauma healing, it's kind of nice to have something on your head. And then in yogic practice, like your hair is your antenna. And so is part of your cosmic antenna, clairvoyant antenna. And so if you're going out in public or doing your yoga, you're supposed to put it up. For men, it's like right at the top of the fontanelle, like you feel it there, and that protects your crown chakra and your. And
I could see how your hair would draw your attention to it, make you kind of hold that in a different way.
Yeah, well, it's just like it's taking your antenna and like bringing it all in and coiling it and concentrating it here, rather than like letting it just be all.
Well, that makes sense. Yeah, I've never had hair super long, but I imagine if it was like bound into a bun, it would, change the way your scalp felt and draw your attention to that. I know there's that line in the Bible about that's the hair on top of the head is the sign of a woman's power or something. And the Pentecostal church takes that to mean women shouldn't be able to cut their hair at all. So like a lot of people who've been Pentecostal their whole life will kind of have hair that goes down to the floor, and they have to wear it up in a bun or something. But yeah, there's a lot about kind of contacting the divine and hair in different religious traditions.
Oh my gosh, so much. Yeah. And that's one of those things where it's like your hair really is a powerful spiritual. It's very powerful energetically. And so like these traditions where they emphasize hair and the importance of it, like are coming from something that's rooted in truth, but then it ends up being used to like manipulate and to actually undermine the power and the agency of people. Like you can, it's kind of hair is what you do with it. If you use it to express your independence and cut it, then that's, and in those ways, then cool. But if you, but it's sort of ironic, like that they are sort of forcing them to have, I don't know, to maintain that spiritual connection. But I don't know.
Yeah, I think when you take anything that is intuitive and kind of a living wisdom tradition and turn it into a rule, some of that is an inevitability, but the rule is not the point. And when you forget and you turn it into the rule,
Right.
that's like there. I forget. There's like a sect of Judaism where they would always like tie a goat like outside the church, and that was like it became this kind of spiritual practice. And then there was somebody who found some record from like one of the early parts of like where they had settled, and there was like a guy that had like a really bad goat and it would run through the services, and so there was a rule to like tie it up. But everyone forgot that, and then 500 years later they're just tying up a goat because it's what you're supposed to do. And I think when you go into religious traditions, there's like a lot of capacity for like abuse and bad stuff, but there's also kind of an embodied transcendental wisdom that doesn't go away and is there no matter how you contain it in what tradition. And then there's also stuff that's just kind of silly and fun like that, when you look at the way people make meaning and some of the absurdity that goes along with that. Like,
oh yeah, and humor is the best way to make meaning in and of itself. So,
and interesting to end on hair too, because if you look at the biggest difference between reptiles like dragons and mammals, what are the things that we don't lay eggs and we have hair? They don't.
And that's sort of what I was trying to get at. It's like there's a lot that's like physical and external to us. That's like the reason that these creatures are so mystical is because they contain all this stuff that's just invisible. They're energetically, but yeah.
Well, let's wrap there. That's great. We will connect and get something out soon. And I appreciate you joining.
Yeah, thanks, Joel.
Well, see you soon.
Bye.
Hey guys, I wanted to pop in here to give you a quick reminder that we do this podcast for free, and there are significant expenses associated with it, including the biggest resource in my life right now, which is time. One of the things that would really help us, and hopefully would help you, would be to check out one of our sponsors, Hardy Nutritionals. Hardy is a vitamin company that I never encountered the advertising of. We heard over and over again from multiple people with treatment-resistant anxiety and dopamine disorders like bipolar disorder and other things that they had tried everything and Hardy was what worked. And so I checked them out, and they have really good research. I'm not a fan of a lot of the BS that's in the supplement and wellness space. Hardy paid for a lot of research on their product, and when I ordered some for myself, I saw a big difference in my life. And my wife made fun of me, thought I was going to be Alex Jones selling vitamins on the radio, and when she tried them, she really liked them too. There's a lot of data about how they can reduce the symptoms of ADHD without medications or lower your need for medication, also manage some of the effects of autism spectrum disorder, and a whole lot of other things. Newer research around nutrition is saying that the synergistic effects of multiple things being planned to work together is a lot more effective than one thing working alone. You can get a lot of information about that on our website, or you can head over to Get Hardy, that's GETHARDY, and use offer code TAPROOT for 15% off. It would help them, it would help me, and it also would probably help you. One of the more frequent things that patients and people in the randomized controlled trials that Hardy conducted report is that they feel more themselves, more focused, and more effective at getting things done, which can result in all of us having a little bit more time.